I'm interested in the idea that the Branwen story, that's the second branch of the Mabinogi, has analogues in ancient Babylonian legends. This is something that comes up in the work of authors Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett, and they cover it in great detail in their book on the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant. Wilson and Blackett have said that there are hermetic principles in the story and hidden themes of a great flood and of creation. They're sort of influenced by the past movements of planets and other celestial bodies. It's a story that they believe came to Britain by way of an ancient migration. The second branch of the Mabinogi is one of the best known prose tales in Welsh literature, and sometimes described as the oldest prose tale in all of Britain, probably authored in the 11th century, but from source material that clearly has themes from the ancient past. The heroine is Branwen, the sister of the King of Britain and wife to the King of Ireland. She dies and is buried towards the end of the story in Glan Alaw, Ynys Môn, having suffered a broken heart after a war destroyed her family and the ruling dynasties of both Britain and Ireland. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't read it yet. A lot of this I've summarised in a previous video on the meaning of Tal y Bolion, where I suggest that the Branwen story is indicative of the symbolic importance of horses to Welsh culture. So this hidden flood theme is really important to Wilson and Blackett's interpretation of the story, and is embodied in the main character, Branwen. Now, up until now, I've only referred to this character as Branwen, as do the oldest manuscripts that contain the story, except in a single instance, where Llyfr Gwyn Rhydderch uses the name Bronwen, but probably a scribal error, as this manuscript uses Branwen with an A in all other instances. The two names, although clearly similar, have different meanings. Bronwen with an O means white breast, while the more ubiquitous Branwen means white raven. Interestingly, it is the variant Bronwen, meaning white breast, that Wilson and Blackett use. The meaning of this is important to their interpretation, because they see this character as symbolising the breaking, foaming waves, an important part of the flood metaphor that they've suggested is hidden in the story. But it's not really common to see this character referred to as Bronwen. Presumably, Wilson and Blackett have felt that it was a more authentic name for the character, but they don't really go into why they use this rather than Branwen, which is what she's called in the oldest manuscripts, except once. So I wanted to have a look into it to see what the proper name should be, and the answer was actually quite easy to get hold of. There even seems to be a scholarly consensus that the original name of this character was Bronwen. Sioned Davis is an authority on the Mabinogi, and she says this: Branwen, daughter of Llyr. The name occurs once as Bronwen, meaning white breast, a common female attribute. Compare the heroine Olwen, whose breasts were whiter than the breast of a white swan. Bronwen may have been the older form, which was later influenced by the name of her brother, Bran. There we are, the name has probably been corrupted to Branwen because of the influence of the name of her brother, Bran. But are there any records of this variant Bronwen being used? This would help corroborate the argument, because the oldest manuscripts do actually use Branwen, except once. Well, yes, there are records actually. Traditionally, a site has been associated with the grave of Branwen. The oldest description of the grave is actually in the text of the second branch itself. The text says that after Branwen returns from Ireland to Ynys Môn, having suffered a great loss, she dies of a broken heart on the banks of the Alaw. The text says, a doddi ei chenaid fawr, a thorri ei chalon ar hynny, a gwneithir bedd petriol iddi, ei chladdu yno, yng Nglan Alaw. In English, she gives a mighty sigh, and with that her heart breaks, and they make a four-sided grave for her and bury her there on the banks of the Alaw. Amazingly, this site is still known, and the monument that the text seems to refer to still partially survives in an area traditionally known as Ynys Bronwen. Yes, Bronwen with an O. Records of the association go back to at least the 17th century. Then in 1813, the farmer excavated the site to quarry some stone. Several contemporary accounts of this survive, including this one by Richard Hall. In 1813, a most interesting discovery was made. A farmer, living on the banks of the River Alaw in Anglesey, having occasion for some stones, supplied himself from a carnedd which was close to the river, and having removed several, he came to a kist of coarse flags covered over. On removing the lid, he found within an urn of ill-baked earth, about a foot high. placed with its mouth downwards, full of ashes and half calcined fragments of bone. The very spot has always been called Ynys Branwen. So both the grave and the area contain the Branwen element, and until relatively recently, this is the variant that's been used. But if you notice how the area is recorded these days, you will see it's been changed to Branwen, and I'm not sure why. The Branwen spelling does seem to corroborate the idea that this was the original name for the character. Now, before I finish, I'm just going to quickly look at this monument because I'm interested to see if it could relate to the historical Branwen, because it has been excavated several times and a lot is known about it. So the most prominent feature is the central standing stone, which has a cleft right through the middle. Could this represent Branwen's broken heart that was described in the Mabinogi? Is this really her grave? Well, actually, the monument seems to be related to the burials of several people, possibly two family groups. Most of the burials seem to have been made at the same time and buried under or close to the inner edge of a cane ring which surrounds the central standing stone. The stone seems to have been the original monument at the site, and the burials and other features added later. A lot of pottery was excavated, some containing burnt bones, one curiously containing infant year bones, and what the thought process behind this was, I have no idea, but the author of the archaeological report does draw parallels of this practice with other sites. Another pot contained a jet and amber necklace, exotic ornaments signifying wealth, also the bone pommel from a small knife. Looking at the diagrams from the dig from the late 1960s, there's no sign of the kist that was mentioned in 1813, indicating that the farmer did make off with the stone in the early 19th century. I imagine that the kist was located in the area labelled as disturbed, near to the central stone. Now, this site is dated to the Bronze Age, and if you remember from my video on Talabolion, I suggest that the Mabinogi is actually set in the late Iron Age. So the site of Bedd Branwen probably predates the second branch of the Mabinogi by over 1,000 years. Okay, I hope that was interesting. I'm going to end now. The main point to take away is that the heroine from the second branch of the Mabinogi was probably originally called Bronwen.